Amelia Vance had always been able to outrun her mistakes. But one night, with her baby in the back seat, she made a decision that would change everything. Alex Wright, the man who had pushed her toward her darkest impulses, didn't think the consequences would catch up with them. But when a crash leaves a man fighting for his life, Amelia realizes there's no escaping the truth, or the devastating price she must pay. Amelia Vance had always been known as a free spirit, a young woman who lived life on the edge, often to her own detriment. At just 24, she was a mother to a baby girl named Harper, but motherhood had done little to curb her reckless tendencies. For weeks, she had been struggling with her relationship and personal issues, feeling trapped in a cycle of disappointment and self-doubt. The stress of her daily life seemed endless, and it weighed heavily on her, leaving her feeling overwhelmed and desperate for an escape. It had been a rough evening. Amelia had gotten into yet another argument with her boyfriend, Jared. Their relationship was tumultuous, full of passion and conflict, and tonight was no different. Jared had accused her of not taking their family seriously, of not giving him enough attention, and the words stung deeply. Amelia had tried to calm him down, but nothing seemed to work. The tension between them had built to a boiling point, and with one final exchange of angry words, he stormed out of their small apartment, slamming the door behind him. In the silence that followed, Amelia stood alone, her thoughts spiraling. She felt an intense wave of loneliness, a feeling that had become all too familiar in recent months. Jared's departure left her with nothing but the sound of Harper's soft breathing from the crib in the corner. The baby had been asleep for hours, her tiny chest rising and falling gently, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed through the room. Amelia watched her daughter for a few moments, her heart aching. She loved Harper deeply, but in that moment, she felt like she was drowning in a life that wasn't hers, a life that was slipping away before her eyes. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, each second reminding her of the decisions she hadn't yet made. She could try to fix things with Jared, but that would mean facing the reality of their broken relationship, a reality she wasn't ready to confront. Alternatively, she could just leave, disappear into the night and escape the suffocating walls of her apartment. But where would she go? What would she do? Amelia knew she couldn't keep living like this, constantly on the edge, never truly happy, never at peace. That's when the idea hit her. It wasn't a rational decision. It was impulsive, born out of frustration and a desperate need for release. She needed to get away, even if it was just for a little while. She needed to feel free, to feel something other than the weight of her responsibilities. The thought of hitting the open road, of leaving Riverton behind, seemed like the only thing that could bring her any relief. And so, without thinking much further, she grabbed her keys from the counter and headed for the door. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her face, a brief but welcome shock to her senses. Her car was parked a few spaces down, its headlights gleaming under the streetlights. It was a familiar sight, something she had grown accustomed to in the past year since moving out on her own. The car was old and worn, but it had always gotten her where she needed to go, even if she didn't always make the best choices along the way. She slid into the driver's seat, the seatbelt digging into her body as she adjusted herself behind the wheel. For a moment, she simply sat there, staring at the road ahead. The idea of driving felt liberating, like she could escape from everything, her problems, her emotions, the suffocating grip of her reality. The car's engine purred to life as she turned the key, the sound filling the empty space around her. She could almost feel her anxiety easing, the weight of the argument with Jared starting to fade. The temptation to drink was undeniable. The thought had crossed her mind before, but tonight, it felt different. Amelia had been drinking on and off for years, but lately, the habit had become more frequent. She reached into her bag and pulled out a half-empty bottle of vodka she had kept hidden from her friends and family. With a quick glance to make sure no one was watching, She unscrewed the cap and took a long drink, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. The burn of the alcohol was sharp, but it was exactly what she needed, something to numb the pain, something to take her mind off everything. She put the car in gear and began driving, her mind a blur of conflicting emotions. The streets of Riverton were empty at this hour, the town quiet and still. It was as if the world had stopped, and for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt as though she was in control of something, even if that something was just the car speeding down the road. The alcohol began to take effect, dulling her senses and making her feel lighter, more carefree. But at the same time, a small voice in the back of her mind told her that what she was doing was wrong, that driving drunk with her baby at home was dangerous, even foolish. But in that moment, Amelia didn't care. The freedom of the road, the rush of adrenaline, drowned out any concern. It was only later, when it was too late, that she would realize just how far gone she had become, how reckless her choices had become. And by then, it would be too late to undo the damage. Amelia's life began to take on a new rhythm after the accident. Though she and Harper had escaped the crash with only minor injuries, the incident left a lingering sense of guilt that Amelia couldn't shake off. The town was quick to forget, and so was she. At least, that's what she told herself. But deep down, Amelia knew she hadn't learned her lesson. Instead of seeking help or confronting her issues, she chose to bury them, locking away her regrets in the back of her mind, trying to move forward like nothing had happened. The truth was, Amelia had never been the type to sit still for too long. The restless energy that had driven her to make impulsive decisions was still there, pushing her to find new ways to escape. While she tried to pretend everything was fine for the sake of Harper and her family, her nights were filled with quiet desperation. The walls of her apartment felt like they were closing in on her, trapping her in a life she didn't feel ready for. The responsibilities of motherhood, the strained relationship with Jared, and the endless cycles of doubt, these things weighed heavily on her. Amelia began to drink more frequently, seeking solace in the numbing effects of alcohol. One evening, she met Alex Graves. He was everything that Jared wasn't: older, mysterious, and charismatic in a way that drew people in. Amelia first saw him at a local bar, sitting alone at a table near the back. He had a dark, brooding presence, with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence that seemed to set him apart from everyone else. Their eyes met for a moment, and without saying a word, Amelia knew there was something magnetic about him, something that pulled at her curiosity. It wasn't long before they struck up a conversation. Alex didn't ask her about her past. He didn't press her about the details of her life or judge her for her mistakes. Instead, he listened. And for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt seen. She wasn't just a young mother struggling to make it on her own. To Alex, she was someone worthy of attention, someone worth spending time with. He offered her an escape, and in that moment, Amelia couldn't resist. She had always been looking for a way out, and Alex was more than willing to provide it. They began spending more time together, going out for drinks and enjoying late-night conversations. With Alex, Amelia didn't have to be the responsible mother or the emotionally drained girlfriend. She could be someone else, someone carefree and free from the weight of her problems. Alex, too, had his own demons. He never spoke much about his past, but there were glimpses, small hints, that suggested he wasn't the type of man who played by society's rules. He didn't work a regular job, and his connections to the local underground world were never explicitly clear. But Amelia knew enough to recognize that Alex was someone who lived in the shadows, someone who didn't care much for consequences. The more she spent time with Alex, the more she was drawn into his world. It wasn't just the alcohol or the late nights that kept her coming back. It was the sense of excitement, the thrill of doing something dangerous. In the quiet moments when they were alone, Alex would talk about his adventures, his travels, and the freedom he felt in living without rules. Amelia, in her own way, craved that same freedom. The idea of living without boundaries, of breaking free from the mundane, was intoxicating. Her relationship with Jared continued to deteriorate. The tension between them had only worsened since the night of the crash, and they both knew their relationship was on borrowed time. Jared had become distant, withdrawing into himself more and more, while Amelia found herself seeking comfort in Alex. She no longer cared about fixing her relationship with Jared. It seemed pointless, like trying to mend something that was already beyond repair. But the danger of her situation didn't register at first. In her mind, Amelia was just living her life, making choices as they came. What she didn't realize was how deeply Alex's influence was affecting her. She was starting to take more risks, push boundaries further than she ever had before, drinking more heavily, staying out late into the night, and neglecting her responsibilities as a mother. Each decision seemed to lead her deeper into a path she could no longer turn back from. And Alex was always there, encouraging her, telling her it was okay to let go, to stop worrying about the consequences. It wasn't long before Amelia found herself on a path that would ultimately lead to something much darker. She had fallen into a dangerous pattern, one where the thrill of living on the edge became more important than the consequences. She had become numb to the dangers of her actions, blinded by the excitement Alex provided. But despite the excitement, a small voice in the back of her mind still nagged at her, reminding her that she was neglecting the one thing that truly mattered: her daughter, Harper. The love she had for her daughter was still there, deep down, but it was being drowned out by her growing need for escape. The destructive choices Amelia had made with Alex were only the beginning. She had convinced herself that she deserved a break, that she had earned the right to live life on her own terms. But as she continued down this path, the consequences would soon come crashing down around her, and she would find herself facing a reality that she had long tried to avoid. The truth would catch up to her in ways she couldn't yet imagine, and when it did, it would be too late to stop the chain of events that had been set in motion. As the weeks went by, Amelia's life began to spiral even further out of control. The accident she had been involved in seemed like a distant memory now, buried beneath layers of alcohol and reckless decisions. She had pushed it to the back of her mind, convincing herself that it was just a mistake, something that didn't define her. But deep down, she knew she had escaped by mere chance. The guilt from that night lingered, but it was becoming easier to ignore as she lost herself in the haze of her nights out with Alex. Her bond with Alex grew stronger, and their relationship became a dangerous mix of excitement and indulgence. He was always the one encouraging her to go further, to take risks. He wasn't shy about his opinions, and over time, Amelia started to see him less as a man who was just passing through her life, and more as someone who understood her, someone who could offer her the freedom she had been craving. Alex, with his dark charm and effortless confidence, had an influence over her that she had never known before. One evening, after a particularly long night of drinking, Alex proposed a plan, one that would change the course of her life forever. They had been out at a local bar, the neon lights casting a garish glow over their faces as they spoke in hushed tones. Alex leaned in, his breath warm against her ear as he spoke in his usual low, calm voice. "Why don't we take a little drive?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge of excitement. "Let's get away from here, from all this, for a while." Amelia hesitated. The thought of escaping, of just leaving everything behind, was tempting. But her baby, Harper, was at home, and she knew she couldn't simply disappear without consequences. Yet, the lure of doing something reckless, of throwing caution to the wind, was too strong. She grabbed her purse and followed Alex out of the bar. They climbed into her car, and for a brief moment she thought about the consequences of her actions. But Alex's voice, soft and persuasive, drowned out her doubts. "Don't think about it," he said. "Just let go. You deserve this." Amelia, already a few drinks into the evening, turned the ignition and pulled onto the empty road. The cool night air rushed in through the open windows, and the familiar hum of the engine filled the silence between them. She glanced at Alex, his eyes, gleaming with a mix of excitement and anticipation. The drive felt like a blur. She wasn't thinking clearly. Her mind was fogged by the alcohol, and the thrill of the night kept her from considering what was at stake. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of Riverton that the true recklessness of her decision began to set in. The roads were dark and winding, and Amelia could feel the weight of the alcohol in her system. Her reactions were slow, and her vision was slightly blurred, but she kept driving, allowing herself to be swept away by the night. Alex was beside her, his voice coaxing her to go faster, to break the speed limit, to take chances. As they approached a sharp curve in the road, Amelia's hand tightened on the wheel. The car swerved slightly, but she quickly corrected herself. The adrenaline was rushing through her veins now, and she felt a sense of power, like she could control everything. She pressed the accelerator harder, the engine roaring as the car sped down the road. Out of nowhere, a set of headlights appeared in the distance, coming fast toward them. Amelia's heart raced as she swerved to avoid the oncoming vehicle. The car fishtailed, the tires screeching against the pavement as she struggled to regain control. For a brief moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Then the sound of metal crashing into metal shattered the stillness. The other car was coming from the opposite direction, and the impact was devastating. Amelia's car was thrown sideways, the force of the collision sending it tumbling off the road and into a ditch. The world spun around her, the lights from the other car flashing in her eyes as everything went dark. When she regained consciousness, everything was disoriented. Her head throbbed, and her vision was blurry. She could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but it felt like they were miles away. The first thing she saw was Alex, his face a mask of panic. He was already out of the car, shouting something, but his words didn't register. Amelia's mind was racing, and all she could think about was the fact that they had just caused an accident. The other car had been flipped onto its side, its front end crumpled. The driver, a man named Daniel Hayes, was trapped inside, unconscious, and bleeding. Amelia's heart skipped a beat as she realized the severity of the situation. Her thoughts raced, and her first instinct was to flee. She couldn't afford to be caught. She couldn't let anyone find out what had happened. Without thinking, she and Alex scrambled to leave the scene. The driver of the other car wasn't moving, and there was no time to check on him. They ran, making their way back to Amelia's car, which was still sputtering in the ditch. Alex was urging her to leave before anyone noticed them. They didn't stop to look back. They drove off, leaving the wreckage behind them. Amelia's mind was a blur of confusion and panic. What had they just done? The reality of what had happened didn't fully sink in until much later. They had hit someone who could be seriously injured or worse. But Amelia didn't know how to process it. All she could think about was getting away from it, not dealing with the consequences. The next few days were a haze. Amelia did her best to act normal, to carry on with her life as if nothing had changed. But deep down, she knew the truth. They had taken a life. The days after the accident passed in a haze of uncertainty. Amelia did her best to act as if everything was fine, to pretend that the weight of what had happened hadn't already started to crush her. She returned to her routine, picking up Harper from daycare and putting on a facade of normalcy. But inside, the guilt gnawed at her. Each time she looked at her daughter, she felt the sting of what she had done. It was hard to even look at her own reflection without seeing the guilt in her eyes. Alex remained a constant presence, though he was less attentive than before. His once carefree demeanor had shifted, replaced with an air of nervousness. He had insisted that they needed to lay low, that it was best not to draw any attention. At first, Amelia hadn't understood why he seemed so shaken, but as the days wore on, she began to see the cracks in his calm exterior. The man who had once been her escape, her source of excitement, now seemed like a shadow of his former self. He kept urging her to forget what had happened, to move forward, and not to dwell on the crash. But Amelia couldn't forget. The man in the other car, Daniel Hayes, had been in a coma for days after the accident. News reports had been filled with details of the wreck, and as the media coverage increased, Amelia could feel the noose tightening around her. The police had launched an investigation, and Amelia felt a cold sense of dread settle in her stomach each time she heard sirens in the distance. She avoided the news, not daring to turn on the television or check her phone for updates. She could sense that it was only a matter of time before they would come looking for her, before the truth would catch up with her. Alex had been insistent that they stay silent, that they stick to their story if they were questioned, but Amelia could feel the walls closing in. She couldn't keep running forever. A week after the accident, Amelia's worst fears were realized. She was at home with Harper, preparing dinner when there was a knock at the door. The sound of it echoed through the apartment, and her heart stopped. She knew who it was before she even looked through the peephole. 2 uniformed police officers stood outside, their faces serious as they waited for her to answer. "Ms. Vance?" one of them asked when she opened the door. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about an accident that occurred last week. Can we come in?" Amelia felt her stomach drop. She had hoped that somehow they wouldn't trace the crash back. To her, that the investigation would fizzle out and the world would forget. But that wasn't the case. The officers stepped inside, and Amelia instinctively tried to keep her composure, hiding the panic that was quickly rising within her. "Of course," she said, trying to sound calm, though her voice trembled slightly. She led them into the small living room, offering them a seat on the worn-out couch. She had no idea how to handle this, how to speak to them without revealing the truth. "We're investigating a crash that occurred last Friday night. A vehicle, driven by a woman, collided with another car on Riverton's outskirts. The other driver, Daniel Hayes, is currently in critical condition," the officer explained. "We'd like to know if you were in the area at that time." Amelia's mind raced. She felt as though the walls were closing in around her, as though the room was shrinking. She thought about her options, what she could say to avoid implicating herself. Every instinct told her to lie, to deny everything and hope that they would leave without pressing further. But a small part of her knew that it wasn't that simple. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the subtle way they were analyzing every word she spoke. "I was out that night, but I didn't see anything," Amelia said quickly, hoping her voice didn't give her away. "I was just driving around, trying to clear my head." The officers exchanged a glance, and Amelia's heart skipped a beat. There was something about their expression that made her feel like they didn't believe her. She had to maintain control, keep her story straight. But the more she spoke, the more the lie seemed to unravel in her mind. "We're not accusing you of anything, Ms. Vance," the other officer said, his tone somewhat softer. "We just need to know if you might have seen anything that night, if you were near the scene, or if you noticed anything unusual." Amelia swallowed hard. She wanted to tell them everything, to confess, but the thought of what that would mean for her daughter, for her future, stopped her cold. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't let her life fall apart like that. "I didn't see anything, really," she repeated, her voice a little steadier this time. "I don't even know where the crash happened exactly. I was just driving aimlessly. Maybe someone else saw something, but not me." The officers exchanged another look, and for a moment, Amelia thought they might press further, ask more questions. But instead, they stood up, nodding at her. "All right, Ms. Vance. Thank you for your time. If you remember anything else, don't hesitate to contact us." Amelia barely managed to force a smile as they left, closing the door behind them with a quiet click. Her breath came out in a shaky exhale, and she sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. They had been so close to uncovering the truth. She had lied, but it didn't feel like a victory. The guilt continued to gnaw at her, eating away at her insides. No matter how hard she tried to deny it, she knew that the truth would eventually come to light. It was only a matter of time before her life shattered completely. The tension in Amelia's life began to mount as the investigation into the accident continued. Days turned into weeks, and the uncertainty of what would happen next kept her on edge. Every time she heard a siren or saw a police car on the street, her heart would race. The officers had been polite, but their questions had left an impression. They were suspicious. They had noticed something in her story, something that didn't quite add up. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, waiting for her to slip up. The police weren't the only ones who were starting to notice the cracks in her story. Alex had become increasingly distant, his behavior more erratic than ever. At first, Amelia had thought it was just the stress of the situation getting to him, but as time passed, she began to realize that Alex wasn't just worried about the investigation, he was afraid. He avoided talking about the crash altogether, and when they did discuss it, his tone was filled with tension. There was something dark in his eyes, a fear that she couldn't quite understand. Amelia had known from the start that Alex wasn't exactly the kind of man who played by the rules. But this was different. This wasn't just the thrill-seeking danger she had been drawn to. This was something deeper, something more dangerous. One evening, after a long day of avoiding the truth, Amelia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. Harper was asleep in the next room, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to think about the future. Could she continue running from the past? Could she keep pretending everything was fine, when she knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out? The guilt weighed heavily on her chest. It felt like she was suffocating, and no amount of distractions or alcohol could make it go away. Then, the phone rang. The sudden noise cut through the silence, and Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She didn't recognize the number, but instinctively, she knew who it was. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. "Ms. Vance?" The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is Detective Ross with the Riverton Police Department. We need to speak with you." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had been dreading this call, and now it had come. She could feel her pulse quicken as the weight of the situation finally settled in. "We have new evidence related to the accident. We need you to come down to the station." Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur. She was trying to process what the detective was saying, but all she could think about was how close they were to uncovering everything. She had spent so much time running from the truth, lying to herself and everyone around her. But now, it seemed like the walls were closing in. Amelia took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I'll be there in a little while," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After hanging up, she sat there in the quiet of the room, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breath. The truth was coming for her, and there was no way to escape it. She couldn't hide anymore. She couldn't keep running. The drive to the police station felt like a lifetime. Every minute that passed, Amelia felt the pressure mounting. She tried to convince herself that it would be okay, that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But, deep down, she knew that it was only a matter of time before everything would unravel. When she arrived at the station, the familiar, sterile atmosphere of the police department only added to her sense of dread. She was led to a small interrogation room where Detective Ross was waiting for her. He motioned for her to sit down, and she did so, trying to maintain her composure. "Ms. Vance," Detective Ross began, his tone professional but firm. "We've been reviewing the evidence from the accident, and there are a few things that don't quite add up. You mentioned you were driving around that night, but we've found your car's GPS records. Your car was in the vicinity of the crash site. At the exact time of the collision, Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The GPS data. She had forgotten about that. It was irrefutable evidence, and it was clear that the police had already pieced everything together. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought to keep her composure. She couldn't let them see how terrified she was. "Ms. Vance," Detective Ross continued, "we know you were there. We just need you to be honest with us. We're not here to make this harder than it needs to be, but lying to us won't help anyone." The silence in the room stretched out, and Amelia's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on her. What would happen if she told the truth? What would happen to Harper? She had always wanted to protect her, to give her a better life, but now it seemed like that dream was slipping away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amelia spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. "I was there," she admitted, her words hanging in the air. "I was the one driving." Detective Ross leaned forward slightly, his expression softening just a little. "Thank you for being honest. Now let's talk about what happened." Amelia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. The truth was out now. There was no turning back. She had admitted to the accident, but she didn't know where this would lead. What had started as a moment of reckless decision-making had spiraled into something far more dangerous. And as she sat there in that small, sterile room, Amelia realized that her life, as she knew it, was over.